All right, the first two questions ask us to solve using the square root method. So step one, I'm going to get what's being squared alone. In this problem, I have a 1/2, which I want to cancel, and I can do that by multiplying by the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2 over 1. I have to do it to both sides of the equation, so I'll also multiply the 4. On the left, I get 3x plus 2 squared equals, on the right, 4 times 2 is 8. All right, now that the parentheses are by themselves, I can use the square root to cancel out the exponent of 2. If I do it to the left, I have to do it to the right. So we get 3x plus 2 equals, now when you take the square root of 8, we need to remember that it could be the positive or the negative square root. So we put the plus or minus there. Now I'm going to continue to solve. Start by subtracting 2 from both sides, because now my goal is to get x by itself. And I get 3x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 8. We can't combine these. The square root of 8 needs to stay under the square root, and we can't touch it there. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 3, and I'm left with x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 8 over 3. One last step, if we can simplify the radical, we should. The square root of 8 reduces to 2 radical 2. So the simplified answer is x equals negative 2 plus or minus 2 radical 2 over 3. Question 2, again with square roots. This time it's just x being squared. So I'll start by adding 35 to both sides. And I get 48 equals 3x squared. Next thing I want to do is to divide both sides by 3. That way this cancels, and I get x squared equals 16. Now, to cancel out the exponent of 2, I square root both sides. And I get x equals, don't forget the plus or minus, and then take the square root of 16, that is 4. Here's our final answer. The next two questions say solve by factoring using the GCF method. GCF is greatest common factor. So if I look at 16 and 12, the greatest common factor of both 16 and 12 is 4. So I can divide them by 4. But they also both have an x in common. So the GCF is not just 4, it's 4x. Our GCF comes out front here. And then we actually divide each term. So 16 divided by 4 is 4. And x squared divided by x is x. Then we've got 12 divided by 4 is 3, and x divided by x cancels out. Now we have our two factors, so I set both factors equal to 0, and I solve each one separately for x. So starting over here, divide both sides by 4, and I get x equals 0. There's one solution. And then over here, this one has 2 steps. So I subtract 3 on both sides, and then divide by 4, and I get x equals negative 3/4. Question 4 also has a GCF. That GCF is 2, so I'm going to divide each term by 2, and I get 2 times x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0. Now this question is a little bit different than the one we just did. In the one that we just did, notice that our GCF has an x. So x's are the important parts of our solving. We need to find the x's and solve for them. But if you notice, this 2 doesn't have an x. So instead of trying to solve that, because it doesn't have an x, we just divide it on both sides. Since this is 2 times the parentheses, those cancel. And then 0 divided by 2 is just 0. From here, I'm going to set up big X. So negative 10 is on top, 3 is on the bottom. The two numbers that multiply to negative 10 but add to 3 are 5 and negative 2. So my factored form is x plus 5 times x minus 2. And then I set each factor equal to 0, and I have to solve them. Subtract 5 from both sides. X equals negative 5. And then add 2 on both sides, and x equals 2. All right, question 5 and 6, these are also big X factoring. The first thing you need to do when you do big X is make sure that the equation's equal to 0. So for this one, my first step is to add 4x to both sides. And I get x squared plus 4x minus 21 equals 0. Now I'm going to set up big X. Negative 21 is on top and 4 is on the bottom. Think what two numbers multiply to negative 21 but add to 4, and that would be 3 and negative 7. So my factored form is x plus 7 times x minus 3. And now I need to solve each factor. So x plus 7 equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0. And I solve the first one, I get x equals negative 7. And then I solve the second one, and I get x equals 3. And here are the two solutions to 5. Question 6 is equal to 0, so I can set up big X right away, 24 on top and negative 11 on the bottom. The two numbers that will work for 24 are going to be 8 and 3, both negative, because a negative times a negative is a positive, and then when I add them, I'll get negative 11. So then we set each factor equal to 0 to solve. I'm going to add 8 to both sides. I get x equals 8. And here I'll add 3 to both sides. X equals 3. All right, for the next ones, this is again big X factoring, but now we're going to have an a that's not 1. First step is to get the equation equal to 0. I'm going to subtract the x to both sides because I want to move everything to be with the positive x squared. And then I'll subtract the 12 over as well. We're going to set up big X here. On top, it's a times c. So 6 times negative 12 is negative 72. And on the bottom is negative 1. Two numbers that multiply to negative 72 but add to negative 1 are going to be negative 9 and 8. And then because we multiplied by a on the top, we have to divide by a on the sides. Negative 9 over 6 reduces to negative 3 halves. And 8 over 6 reduces to 4 thirds. Now when we put our factors together for this one, when there's a fraction, we do bottoms up. So for like negative 3 over 2, 2 comes up to be with x, and then the 3 is what comes after the x. So for the second one here, 3, the bottom, comes up to be with x, and then 4 is what goes behind. We then want to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So I'm going to start by this one, adding 3 to both sides. And then I'll divide by 2, and we get x equals 3 halves. For the other one, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. Then I'm going to divide by 3, and x equals negative 4 thirds. There's my two answers. For 8, first I need to get it equal to 0, so I'll subtract over 30. And I get 2x squared minus, 11x minus 30 equals 0. Setting up big X, 2 times negative 30 is negative 60 on top and negative 11 on the bottom. Two numbers that multiply to negative 60 but add to negative 11 are going to be negative 15 and 4. Now again, because a is not 1, we need to divide both sides by a. 4 over 2 equals 2, and negative 15 over 2 does not reduce. So for my factored form, I get 2x minus 15, and then x plus 2 equals 0. And now I need to split them up to set each equal to 0 and solve for x. I'll start by adding 15 to both sides. So 2x equals 15. And then divide both sides by 2, and x equals 15 over 2. For the other side, we're going to subtract 2 from both sides, and x equals negative 2.